They said Margaret Holloway had lost her mind. In a small Vermont town where everyone once knew her name, the 72-year-old widow had become the punchline of Sunday dinners. Why? Because she had just spent her last $3 on something that couldn't even be called a house, a tiny shack, 10 feet by 10 feet, buried under decades of ivy, forgotten by time, sagging under a roof that looked like it might collapse with one strong wind. She had been a teacher in that town for 38 years. She had taught their children, their grandchildren. She had sat by their hospital beds, written their college recommendation letters, mourned at their parents' funerals. And now those same people drove past and laughed at her like she was a stranger. Teenagers filmed her with their phones. A young couple posted a video calling her the homeless lady who bought a matchbox. It hit 800,000 views in a week. But Margaret just kept sweeping that dirt floor, kept clearing those vines, because she had felt something the moment she saw it, something nobody else could see. And what no one in that town could imagine was that behind that rotten wooden door, beneath the cobwebs and the silence of 175 years, there was a secret. A secret that would not only turn $3 into the greatest treasure that town had ever seen, but would force every single person who had laughed at her to face who they really were. Before I tell you what was behind that door, I need you to do one thing. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to hear will stay with you long after this story ends. The Cedar Falls Department of Health and Human Services smelled like burnt coffee and bleach. Margaret Holloway sat on a plastic chair, orange, the kind they bought in bulk in 1987 and never replaced. Her purse rested on her lap, brown leather, cracked at the seams. A gift from Walter on their 35th anniversary. She was counting 3 $1 bills, 17 cents, a nickel that had turned green at the edges. That was it. That was everything. 47 years of marriage, 38 years of teaching English literature at Cedar Falls High School, a house on Maple Street they had paid off in 1998, a retirement account they had built quarter by quarter, a daughter named Adelaide, who used to call every Sunday at exactly 4 in the afternoon. Gone. All of it. Gone. The fluorescent light above her flickered. She looked up, then back down at the money in her hand, $3.17. She thought about laughing, just to see if she still could. She didn't. Holloway? The voice came from behind a plexiglass window. A woman in her 40s, tired eyes, hair pulled back in a bun that had been pulled back for too many hours. Margaret stood. Her knees clicked. They had been clicking since 2019. Walter used to joke about it. Maggie, you sound like a coffee percolator getting out of bed. She used to swat his arm and tell him to hush. Walter wasn't here anymore to make jokes about her knees. She walked to the window. Name? Margaret Holloway. Date of birth? March 12th, 1953. Reason for assistance? Margaret opened her mouth and closed it. Because how do you say it? How do you put it in one neat sentence for a woman who has heard it 10,000 times before? How do you explain that your husband forgot your name on a Tuesday in October, and then forgot his own name by Christmas, and then forgot how to swallow by spring, and then was just gone? And the bills kept coming and coming and coming, like a tide that wouldn't stop coming in? How do you say that without crying? You don't. You just say the short version. My husband had Alzheimer's. He passed 3 years ago. The medical bills took the house. I was renting after that. The rent went up. I lost the apartment. I've been sleeping in my car for 3 weeks. The woman behind the plexiglass nodded. She didn't look up. Current assets? Margaret opened her wallet, held it out. The 3 bills, the coins. $3.17. That made the woman look up. Just for a second. Her eyes softened. Then went tired again. The tired one. I can process emergency food assistance. I can put you on the waiting list for senior housing. The list is currently 6 to 9 months. 6 to 9 months. Yes, ma'am. Margaret nodded. Slow, steady, like she was hearing the time of a train that was already gone. There's a shelter on Birch Street. I called yesterday. They're full. Try again Friday. Friday. Yes, ma'am. Margaret took the papers. folded them once, tucked them into her purse next to the $3. She walked out into the cold. The November sky over Cedar Falls was the color of dishwater. The kind of gray that made you forget the sun had ever existed. The kind of gray that settled into your bones and didn't leave until April. She got into the Buick, a 1998 LeSabre Burgundy. Walter had bought it the year their daughter graduated from college. He had been so proud of that car. He had washed it every Saturday for 20 years. He had named it Bessie. He had actually named the car Bessie. Margaret had rolled her eyes every time. She would have given anything to roll her eyes at him one more time. The engine coughed, caught, held. She sat there a moment, hands on the wheel, looking at nothing. Then she pulled out of the parking lot. She drove through Cedar Falls slow. The way you drive through a town that used to be yours, the library where she had spent every Saturday morning for 20 years, the high school where she had taught Faulkner and Hemingway and Toni Morrison and Emily Dickinson, the little white house on Maple Street with the blue shutters Walter had painted himself. Somebody else's car was in the driveway now. She didn't look long. She kept driving. She passed the Callahan Bakery on Main Street. The windows were warm and yellow against the gray afternoon. Inside, she could see Ruth Callahan behind the counter, pulling a tray of cinnamon rolls. Laughing at something a customer said, Ruth Callahan, who had been Ruth Pemberton in 1989 when she sat in Margaret's 11th grade English class. Ruth, who had failed her midterm and then come crying to Margaret's classroom after school. Ruth, who had said, I don't think I can do this anymore, Mrs. Holloway. Ruth, whom Margaret had sat with for 3 hours that afternoon. Ruth, whom Margaret had driven to the hospital that same night when the truth came out about the pills. Margaret pulled into a parking spot in front of the bakery. She needed warm water. That was all. Just warm water. To take the pill that kept her cough from becoming pneumonia. She walked in. The bell above the door jingled. Ruth looked up. Their eyes met. A full second. Maybe 2. Margaret saw it happen. The recognition. The flicker. The placing of the face. The remembering. And then Ruth turned away. Just turned. Like she hadn't seen anything. Like Margaret was a stranger she didn't want to deal with on a busy afternoon. She bent down behind the counter, stayed there, pretended to be looking for something. A young man came up to take Margaret's order. Can I help you, ma'am? Margaret stood there. The bell on the door jingled again. Someone else came in, brushed past her. Ma'am? Margaret looked at the young man. He was maybe 20. Pimples. A name tag that said Trevor. She tried to speak. Her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. Just some warm water, please. In a paper cup. He looked at her funny. But he got the water. She took it. She tried to leave a quarter on the counter. Trevor pushed it back. No charge, ma'am. She nodded, walked out. The bell jingled behind her. Ruth never came up from behind the counter. Margaret got back in the Buick. She sat there with the warm cup pressed against her chest. And here is the thing nobody tells you about being old and poor and alone. The hunger is not the worst part. The cold is not the worst part. Sleeping in a car when you are 72 years old with arthritis in both knees is not the worst part. The worst part is being unseen by someone who used to look at you like you were the reason they were still alive. Margaret put her forehead against the steering wheel. She did not cry. She had not cried since the day they put Walter in the ground. There was something inside her that had locked itself up that day and refused to open. She wasn't sure she could cry anymore, even if she wanted to. After a while, she lifted her head, took the pill, drank the warm water, started the car. She drove with no destination. She just drove, because if she stopped, she would have to figure out where to park for the night. And figuring out where to park for the night was a thing she could not handle thinking about right now. She drove out of downtown, past the elementary school, past the cemetery where Walter was buried, under a maple tree. She did not look at the cemetery. She kept driving. The road wound out toward the edge of town, past the old Jenkins farm. Margaret had known Hollis Jenkins 30 years. He had died last spring. No family. The whole farm was up for auction now, piece by piece. A hand-painted sign caught her eye. Estate sale today. Everything must go, including outbuildings, cash only. Margaret slowed. She didn't know why. She really didn't. Maybe because the parking lot looked warm. Maybe because there were people. Maybe because pretending to shop was something to do that wasn't crying in a Buick. She turned in. She parked. She got out. The yard was crowded. Folding tables stacked with chipped dishes and old lamps. Boxes of paperback books. A pile of garden tools rusted into a single shape. People wandered around with that estate sale look on their faces. The look that says, I am pretending I came for something specific, but really, I came to paw through a dead man's things. Margaret walked slow. She did not touch anything. She just looked. $25 for a chair. $15 for a lamp. $8 for a box of John Grisham novels. $25. She had $3.17. She was about to turn around and leave when she saw the second sign. This one was smaller, taped to a tree at the back of the property, the handwriting wobbly, the marker faded. Outbuilding, back corner, as is. $5 or best offer. Margaret stared at it. She didn't know why. She walked toward the back of the property, past the barn, past the chicken coop, past a tractor that hadn't run since the 90s. And then she saw it, at the very back of the property, where the lawn ended and the woods began, where nobody had walked in maybe 40 years. A tiny structure, 10 feet by 10 feet, maybe less, so overgrown with ivy and wild honeysuckle and creeping vines that you could barely tell it was a building at all. It looked like a small green hill with a roof poking out of the top. One window, broken, the frame swallowed by leaves. The door barely visible behind the curtain of green. Margaret stopped. She just stopped walking. Something inside her chest did a thing. It was not a feeling she could name. It was not joy. It was not recognition. It was not nostalgia. It was a feeling like the feeling she had the first time she walked into the little white house on Maple Street as a 25-year-old bride. Walter had carried her over the threshold. He had set her down in the empty living room with the sun coming through the bay window, and he had said, Maggie, we're home. That feeling, standing in front of a vine-covered shack in the back corner of a dead man's farm. That feeling, a man's voice behind her. You folks interested in that thing? She turned. He was in his 50s. Stained jeans. A clipboard. The estate sale manager. What is it? Margaret asked. Hell if I know. Been there since before Hollis bought the place. He never used it. Just let it go to seed. How old is it? Old. That's all I can tell you. Sign says $5. But honestly, lady, if you've got 3, it's yours. I just need it gone before sundown. Margaret looked back at the shack. $3. She had exactly $3. This was a sign she could not explain. A coincidence that was not a coincidence. Walter had been a religious man. He had believed in signs. Margaret had always teased him about it. Walter Holloway, God does not communicate through parking spaces and traffic lights. He used to laugh. Maggie, he communicates through whatever he wants to. You just have to be paying attention. She was paying attention now. She remembered something else. Something Walter used to say, back when they were young and broke, and she was scared about whether they could afford to have a baby. He had taken her hand across the kitchen table, and he had said, Maggie, sometimes the right thing looks like the crazy thing. Don't be afraid to look like a crazy person if your heart knows. 47 years ago he had said that. She had not thought of those words in decades. They came back now, whole, word for word, as clear as if he were standing behind her. She turned to the estate sale manager. I'll take it. He blinked. You'll take it. Yes. For $3. He stared at her a long moment. Then he laughed. Not unkindly, just confused. Lady, I gotta be straight with you. That thing is probably full of mice. There's no electricity, no plumbing. The roof's probably got holes in it. You can't live in it. I'll take it. You sure? I'm sure. He shook his head, smiled, pulled a notepad off his clipboard. Your funeral. Let me write up the bill of sale. I'll need your $3. Margaret opened her wallet. She took out the 3 $1 bills. Her hand shook a little, not from cold, from the strangeness of doing the craziest thing she had ever done in her 72 years on this earth. She handed him the money. He took it, counted it, wrote out a bill of sale on his notepad, tore the page off, handed it to her along with a rusted iron key on a piece of twine. All yours. God help you. That was when she heard the laughter behind her. Not a child's laughter. Not a warm laughter. A young man's laughter. Sharp, mean, the kind that wants to be heard. She turned around. He was maybe 28. Lean. Expensive jacket. The kind of jacket that costs $800 and is designed to look like it costs $40. Beside him, a woman about the same age. Blonde. Sunglasses on top of her head, even though it was November, and gray. Both of them holding their phones. Both of them recording. Bro, the young man was saying. Saying it to the phone, not to her. Bro, she actually bought it. $3. The lady actually paid $3 for that pile of sticks. The blonde woman was giggling. Oh my God. Brennan, look at her face. I am looking at her face. This is going to do numbers. Babe, this is going to do numbers. Margaret stood very still. Her face went hot. She knew her face was hot because she could feel it. The blood rising. The way it does when you are 17 and someone has just laughed at you in the hallway. The way it does when you are 72 and a child with an $800 jacket is filming you for entertainment. She made herself breathe. She thought about Walter. Maggie, hold your head up. Always hold your head up. They don't get to take that from you. She held her head up. She walked past them. The bill of sale in one hand, the rusted key in the other. She did not look at the phones. She did not look at their faces. She walked to her Buick. She got in. She closed the door. She did not start the engine right away. She just sat there, holding the key. $3. The last $3 she had in this world. Spent on a shack covered in vines that everyone with eyes could see was worthless. What had she just done? What had she just done? She started the engine. She drove around to the back of the property. Slow, bumping over the rough ground. The Buick was not made for off-roading. The Buick made several opinions known about the situation. She parked. She got out. She stood in front of the tiny structure. The sun was starting to go down. The light was coming through the trees, the color of old honey. The ivy on the walls of the little building was catching that light and turning it gold. For just 1 second. The shack looked beautiful. Margaret walked up to the door. She pulled back the curtain of vines. Her hand came away wet from the leaves. She found the lock, old iron, rusted nearly shut. She put the key in. Jiggled it again. It turned. She pushed the door. The door did not move. She pushed harder. She put her shoulder against it. She was a small woman, 5'2", 110 pounds. She did not have a lot of leverage to give. She pushed again. The door groaned. The hinges screamed. And the door swung inward in a sudden lurch that almost sent her sprawling. The smell hit her first. Mildew, wet wood, the dust of 100 years of being closed up. Something else underneath. Something almost sweet, like old paper. She pulled out her cell phone. Turned on the flashlight. An ancient flip phone. The flashlight was weak, but it was enough. She stepped inside. The floor creaked, but it held. She moved the light around the room. Dirt floor, no weight, wood floor. Wood planks under a thick layer of dirt and dead leaves. Walls of old pine boards, gray with age, but solid. A ceiling higher than she had expected. Maybe 8 feet. 2 small windows, both filthy. One broken. A small fireplace built of fieldstone in one corner. A fireplace. A real fireplace. The space was tiny, but it was hers. She stood in the middle of the room, the flashlight in her hand, her own breath visible in the November cold. And for the first time in 3 years, she felt something. She didn't know what it was yet, but she felt something. She walked out, locked the door, got back in the Buick. She slept in the car that night, parked just outside the property, on the side of the road. She did not feel safe enough yet to sleep inside the structure. Not until she knew what was in there. Not until she had cleaned it. Not until she had checked for whatever might be living in the walls. She woke up at 5 in the morning to the sound of her own coughing. Deep, wet, painful coughing, the kind of coughing she remembered hearing from her own grandmother in 1962, right before her grandmother went to the hospital and didn't come home. Margaret sat up in the front seat of the Buick. She pressed her hand to her chest. She thought, I cannot get sick. I cannot get sick. I cannot. But she was getting sick. She drove back to the shack as the sun came up. She spent the whole day cleaning, with a broom she had pulled from a dumpster behind a hardware store on the way over, with rags she had cut from an old flannel shirt of Walter's that she kept in the trunk, with a bottle of water she had refilled at a gas station. By noon her arms ached. By 2 o'clock her cough was worse. By 4 she had cleared the main floor, swept out the dead leaves, wiped down the window sills, dragged the rotted curtains outside, and stacked them in a pile to burn. That was when the first car drove by. Slow. A pickup truck. She recognized it. Dale Pritchard. He had worked at the high school as a janitor when Margaret was teaching. They had passed each other in the hallway 5,000 times over 20 years. He slowed all the way down. He stared. He kept going. 20 minutes later he was back, with another truck behind him, then another car, then another. Within an hour, there were 6 cars parked along the side of the road, people with phones out, filming. Margaret kept sweeping. She did not look at them. She did not stop. Her face was hot. Her chest was tight. Her cough was making it hard to breathe. But she kept sweeping. A car door slammed. Footsteps in the gravel. Voices. Mrs. Holloway? She turned. It was a woman, about her own age, heavy gray cardigan, reading glasses on a chain around her neck, practical shoes. A face Margaret did not immediately recognize, then did. Dorothy Pemberton. Dorothy and Earl Pemberton had owned the property next door to the Jenkins farm for 40 years. Earl had died of a heart attack on his tractor in 2017. Margaret remembered Walter going to the funeral. She had not been able to go herself because she had been with her own father in the hospital that week. She had sent a casserole. Dorothy had sent a thank you note. They had been on Christmas card terms ever since, but had not had a real conversation in maybe a decade. Dorothy was carrying something. A pot, with a lid, steam rising from under it. Mrs. Holloway, Dorothy said again. I saw the cars. I came over. Margaret did not know what to say. I brought you soup, Dorothy said. Margaret opened her mouth, closed it, opened it. You don't have to. I'm fine. Margaret. Margaret stopped. Margaret. Honey, you are coughing like a woman who is not fine. Dorothy. I can't pay you for the soup. I don't. Did I ask you to pay me for the soup? No, but then stop talking and come sit down. There was a tree stump just outside the shack, big and flat, probably an old oak that someone had taken down a long time ago. Dorothy gestured to it. Margaret sat. Her legs were shaking. She had not realized her legs were shaking. Dorothy handed her the pot. It was chicken and dumplings. Margaret looked down at the steam rising from the pot, and something cracked. Something in her chest. Something she had locked up 3 years ago when they put Walter in the ground. It cracked. She did not cry. She did not have the energy to cry. But she made a sound. A small, ugly sound. Like a thing she had been carrying for too long finally being set down. Dorothy sat next to her on the stump. She did not say anything. She just sat. After a long minute, Margaret said, I bought a shack for $3, Dorothy. I heard. Everyone is filming me. I know. My husband is dead and my daughter doesn't speak to me and I am 72 years old and I just bought a shack for $3. I know. What is wrong with me, Dorothy? Dorothy was quiet a long time. Then she said, Nothing is wrong with you, Margaret Holloway. There is something wrong with all of them. She gestured at the cars on the road. And honey, I do not know what made you buy this place. I do not know why you, of all people, are sitting on a stump in front of the ugliest shack in Cedar Falls, eating my chicken and dumplings on a Tuesday afternoon. But I am going to tell you something. Margaret looked up. Whatever made you do this, whatever you felt when you saw it, whatever your husband would have said, I would trust it. I would trust it, because I have been a widow for 9 years, and I have learned that the worst thing in the world is being a woman who stopped trusting her own knowing. Margaret stared at her. Dorothy patted her knee. Eat the dumplings, honey, before they get cold. We'll figure the rest out. So she ate. The two of them sat together on the tree stump in the November cold, while cars rolled by slow on the road. People filmed, people laughed. The young couple in the expensive jackets came back and got more footage. Brennan Ashcroft and Sloane Ashcroft. Margaret would learn their names later. By the end of the week, their TikTok would have 800,000 views, and the caption would read, "The homeless lady who bought a matchbox." But that afternoon, Margaret just ate dumplings. And Dorothy Pemberton just sat with her. And somewhere underneath the dirt and the leaves of a tiny shack that had been buried under ivy for 175 years, something was waiting. That night, Margaret slept inside the structure for the first time. Dorothy had brought over a sleeping bag and an old camping lantern from her late husband's hunting things. Margaret had protested. Dorothy had ignored her. "I will be back in the morning with coffee," Dorothy had said. "Do not argue with me. I am older than you. Dorothy, you are 7 years younger than me. I am older in spirit." Margaret had laughed, a small laugh, a surprise laugh. The first laugh she had laughed in 3 years. Now she was alone again. In the dark. In the little stone fireplace, she had built a small fire from broken branches she had gathered outside. The fire popped and crackled. The light moved across the walls. She lay on her back in the sleeping bag on the wooden floor, looking up at the ceiling. Her cough was a little better. Her body ached from a day of cleaning. But she was warm, and she was indoors, and she had a roof. She turned her head to the side. The firelight was catching on something on the far wall. She had not noticed it before. She sat up, slow. Her knees clicked. She picked up the lantern, walked over. The wall was old pine board, gray, dusty. She lifted the lantern. There, carved deep into the wood, carved by someone who had taken their time, carved by someone who had wanted it to last. Letters. Iha, a dash, and below that, smaller, almost worn away, but still readable. Where the light does not go out. Margaret stood with the lantern in her hand. Her own breath was loud in her ears. Ha, 1851. She knew those initials. She knew them because they were initials she had grown up hearing. Initials her own mother had spoken with reverence. Initials carved into the back of an old Bible that sat on her grandmother's mantelpiece. Elizabeth Holloway, her great-great-grandmother. A woman she had heard about her whole life and never been able to find a single picture of. A woman who had supposedly been a teacher somewhere in Vermont in the 1800s. A woman whose life had been swallowed by history. Margaret pressed her hand against the carved letters. The wood was rough under her palm. 175 years old. And here she was, standing inside a shack she had bought for $3, touching the name of a woman who had touched this same wall in 1851. Margaret's knees gave a little. She sat down, right there, on the floor, her hands still on the wall. The fire popped behind her, and outside the windows, out in the dark Vermont night, the wind moved through the trees. She whispered into the empty room. "Walter," just his name, Walter. "What did you do?" The fire popped again. She did not get an answer. She did not need one. She already knew that whatever was about to happen, it had been waiting for her. For 175 years, it had been waiting. Margaret did not sleep that night. She lay on the wooden floor in Dorothy's sleeping bag, and she stared at the ceiling. The fire burned down to embers. The embers burned down to ash. The cold crept in around the edges of the door, and she stared at the ceiling. Where the light does not go out. She had grown up on stories about Elizabeth Holloway. Her grandmother had told them. Sitting in the kitchen on Sunday afternoons after church, Margaret, 8 years old, cutting carrots for pot roast. Maggie, your great-great-grandmother Elizabeth, was a teacher, a real teacher. Back when ladies were not supposed to be such things. Margaret had asked where. Her grandmother had said, somewhere in Vermont. I don't know where exactly. The family records were lost in the fire of 1906. Margaret had asked if there were any pictures. Her grandmother had shaken her head. There was one. A wedding photograph. It burned with everything else. A teacher, somewhere in Vermont. For 64 years, Margaret had carried that name around as a half-remembered legend. A woman she could not find. A piece of her own bloodline that had slipped through history's fingers. And now, Now her own hand had touched the wood that woman's hand had touched. Margaret rolled onto her side. She watched the last red glow of the embers in the fireplace. She thought, I have to know who you were. I have to know. The next morning Dorothy showed up at 7:30 with a thermos of coffee and a paper bag of biscuits. She knocked on the door of the shack like it was a regular house. Margaret opened it. Dorothy looked at her. You did not sleep. How can you tell? Margaret Holloway, I have known your face for 40 years. You did not sleep. Come look at something. Dorothy came in. Margaret pointed at the wall. Dorothy walked over. Read the carving. Read it again. Then turned to look at Margaret. Slow. Like she was afraid the wrong move would knock something over. Margaret. I know. I know. Holloway? It has to be. Honey. The dates. I know the dates. 1851. I know. Dorothy sat down on the floor. Right there, cross-legged like a teenager. Her knees popped, and she winced, and she did not care. She put her hand on the floor, next to the wall. What are you going to do? I am going to the library. Today, you are going to walk into Cedar Falls Public Library with that cough. Yes. In those clothes? Yes. Margaret. Dorothy. I have to know. Dorothy looked at her a long moment. Then she nodded. Once. Decided. All right. But you are not going alone. And you are not wearing that sweater. I have one in my car that is twice as warm. Dorothy, don't argue with me. We have been over this. Margaret almost laughed. She let Dorothy give her the sweater, a heavy gray cable knit. Earl Pemberton's. Dorothy had been carrying it in her trunk for 9 years. Margaret put it on. It smelled faintly of cedar and pipe tobacco. It smelled like a man who had been gone a long time, but had been loved. She did not say anything about that. She did not need to. Dorothy drove them in her Subaru. Margaret sat in the passenger seat watching Cedar Falls roll by. The town looked different to her now. Different because something had shifted, because something underneath her feet had shifted, because for the first time in 3 years she was not just trying to survive the next hour. She was looking for someone. Cedar Falls Public Library was a small brick building from the 1920s. Margaret had spent 20 years here on Saturday mornings. She had read every shelf of fiction at least once. The librarian who used to work the front desk was a woman named Gertrude, who had retired in 2015. Margaret braced herself for whoever sat at that desk now. The woman behind the desk was maybe 34. Long brown hair pulled back in a low bun, a cardigan that was a slightly different shade of gray than her dress, reading glasses pushed up on her head, a name tag that said Hannah Whitfield, Head Librarian. She looked up when they walked in. Her eyes went to Margaret first, then to Dorothy, then back to Margaret. Margaret could see her processing. The cough, the clothes, the sweater that was too big, the whole picture. She watched the woman's face decide what to make of it, and then the woman's face just settled. Not pity, not suspicion, just settled, like a person settling into a chair to listen. "Good morning," Hannah said. "Can I help you find something?" Margaret swallowed. She had not had to ask a librarian for help in a long time. She had always been the person other people came to with questions. The English teacher, the reference for the senior project, the lady who knew where the books were. She did not know how to be on this side of the desk. She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. "I am looking for information about a woman who lived in Cedar Falls in 1851. Her name was Elizabeth Holloway." Hannah's eyes flickered. 1851. Yes, that is very early for this area. I know. Most of our archived materials start in the 1870s. After the town was incorporated. I know that too. Hannah looked at her a moment longer. Then she said, "But," she let the word hang. She stood up. "But we do have a historical collection. In the back. It is mostly uncatalogued. I have been trying to get it sorted for 2 years. There are some materials from before incorporation. Letters, maps, a few diaries. Could I see them?" "Yes." Hannah hesitated. "Then, are you family?" To Elizabeth Holloway. Margaret nodded. I think so. Yes. Then please, come with me. Hannah led them into a back room. The room smelled like old paper and dust, and the particular kind of climate-controlled silence that only exists in libraries. 3 walls of shelves, a long oak table in the middle, a single window looking out onto the back parking lot. Hannah Whitfield turned on the overhead light. She pulled down a box from the top shelf, then another, then a third. These are 1845 through 1860, she said. I have been working through them on weekends. I have read about half. I have not seen the name Holloway, but I have not finished. You read them on weekends, Margaret said. Why? Hannah looked at her. Because somebody should. Margaret felt her throat do a thing. She did not say anything. She sat down at the oak table. Dorothy sat next to her. Hannah sat across from them. The 3 of them opened the first box. For the next 4 hours they did not speak unless they had to. They pulled out letters, tied with faded ribbon, land deeds, maps drawn in brown ink on heavy paper that crackled when you breathed on it. 2 diaries written in cramped handwriting that Margaret could barely read. Margaret read. She read the way she used to read student essays. Slow, careful, looking for the thing underneath. By 11:30 her eyes were burning. By 12:30 her cough was worse. At 1:15 Hannah Whitfield stood up, walked out, came back with a paper cup of hot water and a tea bag. She set it in front of Margaret. She did not say anything. She just sat back down and kept reading. Margaret did not say thank you out loud. She said it with her eyes. At 3:47 in the afternoon, Dorothy made a noise. A small noise. The kind of noise a person makes when they have been holding their breath for a very long time. Margaret looked up. Dorothy was holding a letter, yellowed, cracked at the folds, the handwriting careful, looped, feminine. Margaret. What? Margaret. Look. Dorothy turned the letter so Margaret could read it. The salutation was, Dear Brother. The signature at the bottom was your loving sister, Elizabeth Holloway. Margaret stopped breathing. For an actual measurable second, she stopped breathing. The letter was dated September 1851. It was written to a man in Boston. It described, in plain, careful prose, the writer's first year in Cedar Falls. Her decision to leave the city, her purchase of 3 acres of land on the outskirts of a new settlement, her construction of a small 1-room building on the western edge of her property, her plans to use that building. Margaret read the next sentence twice, then a third time. The structure is small, but it will serve our purpose. I have begun teaching there in the evenings. 12 children so far. 6 of them are the sons and daughters of laborers who cannot afford the proper school. 4 of them are colored. Their parents have asked me to keep their attendance private. I have given my word. The work is dangerous. The work is necessary. I will not stop. Margaret put the letter down on the oak table. She put both her hands flat on the table on either side of it. She breathed in. She breathed out. Dorothy was crying quietly, without making any sound at all, tears just running down her face, sitting there in a library on a Wednesday afternoon, crying for a woman who had been dead for 150 years. Hannah Whitfield was watching them. Her face was very still. A school, Hannah said. She built a school. Yes. A secret school. Yes. For poor children and black children. In 1851. Yes. Hannah Whitfield sat back in her chair. Then she sat forward again. Then she stood up. Sat down. Stood up. Margaret. What? Margaret, do you understand what you have? I am starting to. This is. I know. This is the most significant historical discovery in this town's history, by a margin you cannot measure. Margaret looked at the letter. Then she looked at Hannah, and the question came out before she could stop it. Is the building still standing? Hannah Whitfield blinked. What? Is it still standing? The school, the structure she built. I do not know. There is no record of it surviving. I would have to. I could check. Hannah. What? I bought it 3 days ago for $3 at the Jenkins Estate sale. The silence in the room was a physical thing. Hannah Whitfield stared at Margaret. Margaret stared back. Dorothy looked at both of them with tears still on her face, and Hannah Whitfield, very slowly, very carefully, sat down in her chair and said, "Oh my God." They drove out to the property that afternoon, all three of them in Dorothy's Subaru, Hannah Whitfield in the back seat, a camera around her neck, a notepad in her lap, her hands shaking just a little. She had called her department head before they left. Margaret had heard her on the phone in the library. "Dr. Albright, I am taking the rest of the day. I will explain on Monday." No, not on the phone, on Monday. The drive took 12 minutes. They pulled up at the back of the Jenkins property. The shack was where Margaret had left it, covered in vines, sagging at the corners, a pile of old curtains still on the burn pile she had dragged outside. Hannah Whitfield got out of the car. She walked toward the building, slow, the way a person walks towards something they have only ever read about. She stopped about 10 feet away. She did not say anything. She just looked. Then she lifted her camera. She took one photograph. She lowered the camera. And then she said something that Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. She said, "Mrs. Holloway, I have been a librarian for 11 years, and before that I was a graduate student in Vermont history for 6 years, and in all of that time I have read about buildings that did not survive, schools that were burned, diaries that were lost, women whose names history forgot." She turned to Margaret. "This building should not exist." Margaret did not know what to say. "This building should not exist," Hannah said again. "And yet here it is. And you bought it? For $3. 3 days ago." "Yes, Mrs. Holloway. I do not know what you believe in, but something brought you here." Margaret thought of Walter. She thought of the way her hand had moved on its own when she pulled the $3 bills out of her wallet. She did not say any of that. She just nodded. The next 4 days were the hardest 4 days Margaret had lived since the week Walter died. Word got out fast. It always does in a small town, especially when something on TikTok has 500,000 views and the woman in the video turns out to maybe have just discovered a piece of national history. The cars on the road went from 6 a day to 30. People with phones, people with questions, people who used to be Margaret's students, people who used to laugh at her at the grocery store. She kept her head down. She kept cleaning. She kept sleeping in the shack at night, with the door barred from the inside with a piece of 2x4 Dorothy had brought over. Hannah Whitfield came every morning. She brought a thermos of coffee, and a notebook, and a camera, and increasingly a face that looked like a person who had not been sleeping either. On the third morning, she brought a man, older, mid-60s, tweed jacket, white beard, glasses on a chain. "Mrs. Holloway, this is Dr. Howard Albright, from the Vermont Historical Society." The man took off his hat. He looked at Margaret. He looked at the building. He took 2 steps forward, stopped, took 2 more steps. He turned to Hannah. "Hannah." "Yes, Hannah. I am going to say something, and I want you to remember the exact words I said, because I am going to deny saying them later." "Okay. This is the most important thing I have seen in my career." Hannah nodded. Dr. Albright walked up to the building. He ran his hand along one of the corner beams. He bent down and looked at the foundation. He looked up at the roof line. He stepped inside through the door Margaret had cleared. He was in there a long time. When he came back out, his eyes were red. He did not pretend they were not. He just looked at Margaret, and he said, "Ma'am, with your permission, I would like to bring a team." Margaret nodded. She did not trust herself to speak. The team came on Saturday. 3 archaeologists, 2 historians, a wood specialist named Dr. Linda Marsh, who had spent 30 years dating buildings by their lumber, a woman with a tape measure and a clipboard whose job nobody bothered to explain to Margaret. They worked for 6 hours. Margaret sat on her tree stump and watched. Dorothy sat with her. Hannah Whitfield sat with both of them. At 3:30 in the afternoon, Dr. Linda Marsh walked over. She crouched down in front of Margaret like a doctor crouching down in front of a patient. "Mrs. Holloway." "Yes?" "Your building dates to 1849, plus or minus 2 years. The wood is hand-hewn white pine. The notches are consistent with construction methods used in this region in the mid-19th century. The roof has been replaced at some point, probably the 1880s. But the walls and floor are original. Margaret nodded. And the carving on the inside wall. The handwriting analysis is preliminary. But I have looked at 3 other documents this morning that we know are in Elizabeth Holloway's hand. The letter forms match. The depth of the carving matches a carving technique that was common among women in domestic settings in that period. Your great-great-grandmother carved that wall, Mrs. Holloway, with her own hand. In 1851, Margaret closed her eyes. Dr. Marsh was not done. There is one more thing. Margaret opened her eyes. What? The floorboard. In the northeast corner, we noticed it sits about a 1/4 inch higher than the others. We have not pried it up. We did not want to without your permission. But Mrs. Holloway, in our experience, when a floorboard in a building from this period sits a little high, it is often because there is something underneath it. The whole afternoon stopped. Everybody stopped what they were doing, even Dorothy. Margaret stood up. Her knees clicked. She walked into the shack. The team followed her at a distance, like she was a bride walking down an aisle. Dr. Marsh handed her a small crowbar. Margaret looked at it, then she handed it back. You do it. Are you sure? My hands are shaking too much. Dr. Marsh took the crowbar. She knelt down. The floorboard came up easier than it should have, almost like it wanted to come up, almost like it had been waiting. Underneath the board, a cavity, 6 inches deep, and in the cavity, a small iron box, about the size of a hardback book, black with age, the lid corroded shut. A simple latch on the front, rusted nearly shut. Dr. Marsh lifted it out, slow. She set it on the floor in front of Margaret. Mrs. Holloway, this is yours. Whatever is in it, it is yours. Margaret knelt down on the wooden floor. Her knees protested. She ignored them. She put her hands on the box. The metal was cold. She tried the latch. It did not move. Dr. Marsh handed her a small flathead screwdriver. Work it slow, side to side. Do not force it. Margaret worked it slow. For 3 minutes. For 4 minutes. For 5. And then the latch gave with a small dry click. She lifted the lid. The first thing she saw was a leather-bound book. Brown. Cracked. The spine intact. She lifted it out. The cover read in faded gilt letters, Journal of Elizabeth Holloway, Cedar Falls, Vermont, beginning the 1st day of June. Year of our Lord, 1851. Underneath the journal, a second book, smaller, bound in cloth. Margaret opened it. It was a list of names, 240 names, written across 30 years. Each name had a date next to it, the date of the child's first day, and sometimes, heartbreakingly, a second date in a different hand, the date the child had stopped coming. Underneath the names, 3 letters, sealed with red wax, the wax intact, the seals unbroken, and at the bottom of the box, a folded document, heavy paper, almost like parchment, with another seal of red wax, a ribbon, a signature in brown ink. Margaret did not touch that one yet. She lifted out the journal instead. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was the same as the letter from the library. Elizabeth Holloway, June 1851. Margaret read the first entry out loud. Her voice was thin but steady. Dorothy and Hannah and Dr. Marsh and Dr. Albright and the rest of the team stood around her in the small room and listened. This day I begin a thing I have promised myself for many years. I have built a small house at the western edge of my land. I have made it modest by intention, so that it will not draw attention, so that what we do inside it will remain between God and the children and me. Tonight I have lit a single lamp, and I have written above the door these words. Where the light does not go out, may God forgive me if I am wrong. May God help me if I am right. Margaret stopped reading. She closed the journal. She held it against her chest. She did not cry. She did not have to. The room cried with her. 3 weeks later, Hannah Whitfield drove out to the property in a panic. She had been spending her evenings cross-referencing the list of 240 names with the Cedar Falls Genealogical Archive. She had a folder under her arm. She walked into the shack without knocking. Margaret was sitting at a small folding table Dorothy had brought over. Reading the journal, She had been reading it for 3 weeks, a page or two a day, slow, like a person rationing the last of something precious. Mrs. Holloway. Hannah, you look like you have seen a ghost. I have. Sit down. Hannah sat. She put the folder on the table. She opened it. I have been doing the cross-references. Like I told you, I am about 2/3 of the way through the list. Yes. Mrs. Holloway, I need to show you some names. She slid the folder across the table. Margaret looked. The first name on the list was Cyrus Pemberton, age 9. First attended the 12th of October, 1854. Margaret looked up. Pemberton. Yes. Is that? That is Dorothy's husband's great-grandfather. Yes. Margaret looked down again. Hester Callahan, age 7. First attended the 4th of March, 1862. Hannah. Keep going. Margaret kept reading. Augustus Callahan, age 11. First attended the 4th of March, 1862. Brother of Hester. Margaret looked up. Ruth Callahan's, from the bakery. Her great-great-grandparents. Yes. Margaret looked down again. She kept reading. She found 7 more names she recognized. 7 family names from Cedar Falls. Old names. The names on the brass plaques at the bank, the names on the boards at the country club, the names of the families who owned the big houses on the hill. And then, near the bottom of the 3rd page, she found one more name. She did not understand at first. She read it 3 times. Josiah Ashcroft, age 6. First attended the 9th of September, 1869. Margaret looked at Hannah. Ashcroft. Yes. Hannah. Ashcroft. That is. Yes. That is the boy who filmed me. With the jacket, the tick-tock. Brennan Ashcroft. Yes. Josiah Ashcroft was his great-great-grandfather. Margaret sat back in her chair. She put both hands flat on the table. She breathed in. She breathed out. Hannah. Yes? How many of the names? How many of the names what? How many of the names on this list are the ancestors of people in Cedar Falls today? Hannah looked down at the folder. I am 2/3 through the list. I have identified 93 names so far that are direct ancestors of current residents. Many of the oldest families in town. The Pembertons, the Callahans, the Ashcrofts, the Marshes, the Hendricks, the Whitakers, the Pritchards. Margaret stared at her. Hannah, this whole town, yes, this whole town exists because of a woman they have forgotten. Yes, Mrs. Holloway. They are laughing at me. On the internet, I know. And their great-great-grandparents learned to read sitting on the floor of this building. Yes. Margaret looked down at the journal in her lap. The leather cover. The careful handwriting. The lamp. The single lamp Elizabeth Holloway had lit on the first night of June in 1851, so that the light would not go out. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, Hannah, I want you to look at the last document, the one with the red wax seal. We have not opened it yet. You said you wanted to wait? I am done waiting. Hannah carefully lifted the folded document from the iron box. She set it on the table. She broke the wax seal. The paper was so old it crackled when she unfolded it. She read the heading out loud. Articles of Trust. Established this 12th day of November, year of our Lord 1875. Hannah's eyes moved down the page. Her face changed. It changed twice. The second time it changed, it went almost gray. Hannah. Hold on. What is it? Mrs. Holloway. Just give me 1 minute. Margaret waited. Hannah read the document all the way through. Twice. Then she put it down, and she looked at Margaret, and she said, Mrs. Holloway, I need to call a lawyer. Hannah. I need to call a lawyer right now. Hannah. What is it? Hannah swallowed. There is a Boston benefactor named in this document. He was a wealthy abolitionist. His name was Cornelius Whitfield. No relation to me, different spelling. In 1875, he learned about Elizabeth Holloway's school. He came to Cedar Falls. He met with her. He admired her work. And before he died, he established a trust in her name. to support the continued education of children in this region. In perpetuity, a trust. Yes. What kind of trust? It was placed in a bank in Burlington that is still in business under a different name. The trust was never claimed, because Elizabeth had no descendants that anyone in 1875 could find. Her brother in Boston had moved west. The family scattered. The trust just sat there. For how long? For 150 years, Mrs. Holloway. Hannah. Yes. How much? Hannah swallowed again. I do not know exactly. Compound interest over 150 years on the principal listed in this document. Conservatively, Mrs. Holloway, we are looking at something in the neighborhood of $1.8 million. The room was very quiet. Margaret looked down at her own hands. She thought about Walter. She thought about the $3.17 that had been in her wallet on Tuesday morning. She thought about Trevor, the kid at the bakery, handing her back the quarter. She thought about Ruth Callahan turning away. She thought about a woman she had never met, a woman whose hand had carved her own initials into the wall of a one-room building in 1851. A woman who had lit a single lamp so that children could learn to read. A woman whose work had built a town that had forgotten her. Margaret thought all of that, and then she did something she had not done in 3 years. She put her face in her hands, and she cried. Not the small ugly sound from the day Dorothy brought her chicken and dumplings. Real crying, the kind that comes up from somewhere underneath everything. Hannah did not move. The cars on the road outside kept rolling slow, and in the corner of the room, on the wall, the carving still said what it had said for 175 years. Where the light does not go out, Margaret cried for 10 minutes. When she stopped, she wiped her face on the sleeve of Earl Pemberton's sweater. She picked up the trust document. She read the last paragraph herself, the one where Cornelius Whitfield had written in his own hand the words that would echo through a century and a half and end up in front of a 72-year-old widow on a Wednesday afternoon. Let this fund be held in keeping for the descendants of Elizabeth Holloway, so that the work she began shall not end, so that the light she lit shall not go out. In every generation a Holloway shall find this. Margaret pressed the document against her chest. She whispered something. Hannah did not catch it. Margaret said it again, louder. To the empty room, to the wall, to the woman who had carved her name into pine boards in 1851. She said, I'm here, grandmother. I am here. That night she dreamed of Walter. She had not dreamed of him in over a year. She had stopped expecting to. There had been a period after he died when she had dreamed of him every night, and it had been a kind of mercy. And then the dreams had stopped. And the stopping had been a different kind of grief. But that night she dreamed of him. He was sitting at their old kitchen table on Maple Street, the one with the nick in the corner where their daughter Adelaide had once dropped a cast-iron pan when she was 6. He was wearing the blue flannel shirt he had loved. He was holding a cup of coffee. He looked up when Margaret came in. He smiled. Maggie, there you are. She sat down across from him. She did not say anything. He reached across the table and took her hand. Maggie, I told you. Sometimes the right thing looks like the crazy thing. She tried to speak. She could not. He squeezed her hand. You did good, Maggie. You did real good. She woke up at 5 in the morning. The sleeping bag, the wooden floor, the little stone fireplace with cold ashes inside, the carving on the wall. She lay very still in the dark. She did not move for a long time. Then she sat up. She wiped her face. She got up. She went outside. The November air was cold and clean. The sky was just starting to lighten in the east, a pale, careful gray. She stood in front of the shack she had bought for $3. She thought about her dream. She thought about Elizabeth. She thought about 240 children. She thought about a town that had forgotten its own beginning. And then, far down the road, she heard a car, humming fast. She squinted into the gray morning light. A black SUV. Expensive. It slowed in front of her property. It stopped. The driver's door opened. A young man got out. Lean, 28, the $800 jacket. Brennan Ashcroft. He stood there in the gray light, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders hunched. He did not have a phone in his hand. He did not have a camera. He looked different. He looked at Margaret. He looked at the ground. He looked back at Margaret. He took 2 steps forward. Then he stopped. He said, his voice low, "Strange, Mrs. Holloway. Do you know who my great-great-grandfather was?" Margaret looked at him. She did not say anything. Brennan Ashcroft swallowed. His name was Josiah Ashcroft. He was a circuit-riding minister in the 1890s. He preached in 3 states. He led a congregation in Vermont for 40 years. My mother has his journal. I read it when I was 13. There is a passage in it I have remembered my whole life. He wrote about a teacher, a woman who taught him to read when he was a child. He wrote that she gave him his life. He wrote that without her he would have been nothing. He never wrote her name. Brennan Ashcroft looked at Margaret. His eyes were wet. His mouth was shaking just a little. "I did not know it was her, Mrs. Holloway. I did not know." Margaret stood in the cold morning light in front of the shack she had bought for $3. In front of the young man who had filmed her for 900,000 strangers. She looked at him. She did not say it cruelly. She did not say it kindly. She just said it the way an English teacher says a sentence she has known in her bones for 40 years. She said, "Then you have something to think about, young man." And she turned around, and she walked back inside, and she closed the door. Margaret stood inside the shack with her back against the closed door. Her heart was doing something it had not done in years. It was beating fast, not from fear, not from the cough that had finally started to ease, not from the cold, from something else, from the way Brennan Ashcroft had looked at her, like a boy, not like a man with a phone, just a boy who had read something in his great-great-grandfather's journal when he was 13 and never forgotten it. Margaret pressed her hands against the closed door, breathed in, breathed out, and she thought, "I am 72 years old. I was a teacher for 38 years. I have stood in front of 1,500 high school students who did not want to read Faulkner. I have buried a husband. I have lost a daughter to silence. I have slept in a Buick for 3 weeks. And I have just been handed $1.8 million. What am I going to do? What am I going to do?" Her own breath came back at her in the cold. She did not know yet, but she knew this. She was not going to do what they expected her to do. The phone call came that afternoon. Hannah Whitfield brought a charged phone to the property, along with a coffee. Margaret's old flip phone was barely working. Hannah had been letting her use the library's spare cell phone for 2 weeks. The phone rang at 3:11 in the afternoon. The number was a Burlington area code. Margaret answered. "Mrs. Holloway?" "Yes." "My name is Patricia Halloran. I am an attorney. I specialize in historical property and trust law. Hannah Whitfield contacted me 3 days ago about your situation. I have spent the last 48 hours reading every document you sent her. Mrs. Halloran." "Patricia, please." "Patricia, I cannot pay you." "Margaret. May I call you Margaret?" "Yes." "Margaret, I am 68 years old. I have been practicing law for 41 years. I have spent the last 3 days reading the personal journal of a woman who taught black children to read in Vermont in 1851. I have not slept much. I do not want your money. I want to help you. Will you let me?" Margaret closed her eyes. She thought of all the times in her life she had been the helper, the teacher, the neighbor, the wife, the one who showed up with casseroles and rides to the hospital and college recommendation letters at midnight. She thought about how hard it was to be on this side, to be the one being helped. She thought of Dorothy Pemberton handing her chicken and dumplings on a tree stump. She thought of Hannah Whitfield putting a paper cup of hot water in front of her in a library. She thought of Walter saying, "Maggie, let people love you. You are very bad at this." She opened her eyes. She said, "Yes, Patricia, I will let you." Patricia Halloran drove out to Cedar Falls the next morning. She was a tall woman, steel gray hair cut short, a camel coat, sensible boots. She walked into the shack like she had been there 100 times. She set her briefcase on the folding table. She opened it. She pulled out a yellow legal pad. She said, "All right. Let me tell you what I have found, And then you are going to tell me what you want. Margaret nodded. Dorothy sat next to her. Hannah sat across from them. Patricia Halloran clicked open her pen. The trust is real. The trust is enforceable. The trust has been sitting in a Burlington bank under 3 different names over 150 years. Every time the bank changed hands, the trust transferred with it. The current institution that holds it is Whitfield Crossing Bank. No relation to Hannah, different family. They have already confirmed receipt of my preliminary inquiry. They are aware. They are not contesting. They cannot contest. The articles are airtight. Cornelius Whitfield was a very good lawyer in 1875. Patricia tapped her pen on the legal pad. Margaret, you are the named heir. You are the only known living direct descendant of Elizabeth Holloway. The trust is yours. Right now, today. If you walked into that bank tomorrow morning and signed 3 pieces of paper, $1.8 million would be wired to whatever account you chose. The room was quiet. Dorothy was watching Margaret. Hannah was watching Margaret. Patricia was watching Margaret. Margaret was looking at the wall, at the carving, where the light does not go out. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, Patricia, yes. How much would it cost to restore this building properly, to historical standards, to make it what it was? Patricia blinked. I would have to get estimates. But for a structure this small, including a permanent foundation reinforcement, period-appropriate restoration, weatherproofing, climate control, and a small adjacent visitor structure, maybe 150,000, maybe 200. And how much? To build a small house on this property, next to the shack, for an old woman to live in. Nothing fancy. 1 bedroom, a kitchen, a real bathroom. 80,000, maybe 90. And how much? To set up a foundation, a real foundation, with a board, with a director, with the legal structure to give out scholarships, to run educational programs, to make sure that what Elizabeth started does not stop again. Patricia set her pen down. Margaret, how much? Patricia, with proper structuring, with an endowment that can sustain itself off interest, with administrative costs covered, with a real legal framework so that no one can touch the principal. Patricia did the math in her head. 1.4 million, maybe 1.5. Margaret nodded. She did the math herself. 1.8 minus 1.5 equals 300,000, minus 200 for restoration, minus 90 for a small house, leaves 10,000 for emergencies. That was enough. That was more than enough. Margaret looked up. She looked at Patricia. She said, Then that is what we are doing. Patricia stared at her. Margaret, what? Margaret, you are giving away $1.5 million. Yes. To a foundation. Yes. You could keep half of that. You could keep all of that. You could live in Florida for the rest of your life. Patricia, what would I do in Florida? Patricia stared at her. Then she put her hand over her mouth. Then she nodded. Then she picked up her pen. She said, All right, let's do this right. The town council meeting was scheduled for the 2nd Thursday in December. The town clerk had announced it. The agenda was one item: discussion of the Elizabeth Holloway Historical Site and Associated Trust. The meeting was supposed to be held in the small conference room. By Tuesday, they had moved it to the main hall. By Wednesday, they had moved it to the high school gymnasium. The local news was coming. The Vermont Historical Society was coming. A reporter from the Boston Globe was coming. A producer from a national public radio program was coming. Margaret did not want to go. She told Dorothy that on Wednesday night, the two of them were sitting in the shack. There was a real space heater now. Patricia had bought it. The shack was warm. Margaret was sitting on a folding chair with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She said, Dorothy, I do not want to do this. I know. I do not want to stand in front of all those people. I know. I taught half of those people, Dorothy. I know you did. And they laughed at me. Dorothy was quiet a moment. Then she said, Margaret, can I tell you something? Yes. When Earl died, I did not leave my house for 6 months. Margaret looked at her. I did not know that. Nobody knew. That was the point. I sat in that house, and I watched the seasons change through the window, and I did not pick up the phone, and I did not answer the door. I just sat there for 6 months. Dorothy, I am telling you this because I know what it is to want to disappear. I know what it is to want to just be quiet for the rest of your life because being loud has gotten you nothing but pain. Yes, but Margaret, you are not just doing this for yourself. You are doing this for a woman who lit one lamp in 1851 so that children could read. You are doing this for the children who do not exist yet. Who will sit in that building someday and learn something because you stood up tomorrow? Margaret looked at her tea. Dorothy reached across the small table. She put her hand on Margaret's hand. You can be scared, honey. You can be terrified. But you cannot be silent. Not tomorrow. Not this one time. Margaret nodded. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The next morning she put on the only nice clothes she had left, a navy blue dress she had worn to teaching conferences, stockings, the good shoes from the trunk of the Buick. She let Dorothy do her hair. Dorothy was not good at hair, but she tried very hard. Margaret looked at herself in the small hand mirror Dorothy held up. She did not recognize the woman in the mirror. A different woman. A woman who had read 150 pages of her great-great-grandmother's journal. A woman who had been visited in a dream by her dead husband and told she had done good. A woman who had work to do. She nodded at herself in the mirror. Okay, she said. Okay, Dorothy said. They drove to the high school. The parking lot was full. The gymnasium was full. Margaret had not been inside the Cedar Falls High School gymnasium in 8 years. The last time had been a retirement party. Hers. They had given her a plaque and a cake and a folding chair with her name on it. The folding chair was still in storage somewhere in the basement of the building. She walked in through the side door. Patricia Halloran met her there. Hannah Whitfield was right behind her. Dr. Albright from the Historical Society was already at the front, sitting at the speaker's table. The bleachers were packed. People Margaret had known her whole adult life. People who had been her students. People who had been her students' parents. People who had been her students' children. She walked toward the front. Heads turned. The murmuring stopped. By the time she reached the speaker's table, the gymnasium was completely silent. Margaret sat down. She put her hands in her lap. She did not look at the bleachers. The mayor called the meeting to order. His name was Frank Hendricks. He was in his 60s. He had been a student of Margaret's in 1978. He had a hard time getting through the opening statement. His voice kept catching. Tonight we have a very unusual situation in Cedar Falls. And before we get into the formal proceedings, I would like to ask Mrs. Margaret Holloway, my former English teacher, to address the town. Margaret stood up. Her knees clicked. She walked to the podium. She set her hands on the wooden edges. She looked out at the bleachers. For the first time, she let herself look. She saw Ruth Callahan in the third row, crying. She saw Brennan Ashcroft, standing at the back, his phone in his pocket for once, his hands at his sides. She saw Dorothy. She saw Hannah. She saw a girl, maybe 14, with braids, sitting next to her mother, watching Margaret with eyes wide open. She saw 100 faces she did not recognize, and 100 faces she did. She breathed in, she breathed out, and she began. She said, "My name is Margaret Holloway. I am 72 years old. 3 weeks ago I had $3.17 to my name. I was sleeping in my car. I was sick. I was alone. I had not heard my daughter's voice in 3 years. The gymnasium was so quiet you could hear the heating vents. 3 weeks ago I bought a building for $3. I did not know what I was buying. I did not know why I was buying it. I just felt something I could not explain. Many of you felt something too. You felt that I had lost my mind. Some of you filmed me. Some of you laughed. Brennan Ashcroft did not look away. I am not here tonight to ask you to apologize. I am not here to ask for anything. I am here to tell you about a woman." Margaret took a breath. Her name was Elizabeth Holloway. She was born in 1823 in Boston. She was educated at a school for young women. She was the daughter of a wealthy merchant, and she was expected to marry a wealthy man and run a wealthy household and disappear into the wallpaper of her own life. A small pause. She did not do that. The room held its breath. In 1851, she came to Cedar Falls. Alone. Unmarried, she bought 3 acres of land. She built a small building, 10 feet by 10 feet. She furnished it with 1 table and 10 chairs and 1 lamp, and she began to teach children to read. Margaret looked out. She taught the children who were not allowed in the proper school. She taught the children of laborers. She taught colored children whose parents had to bring them after dark. She did this in secret. She did this at the risk of her own safety. She did this for 32 years. By the time she died in 1883, she had taught 240 children. A woman in the front row pressed her hand to her mouth among those children. According to records, I have only just begun to verify with the help of Hannah Whitfield from our public library. We're the great-grandparents of Frank Hendricks, the great-great-grandparents of Ruth Callahan, the great-great-grandfather of Brennan Ashcroft, the great-grandfather of Dale Pritchard, the great-grandmother of the woman who runs the post office, the great-great-grandparents of the family that owns the lumber yard, the great-great-grandfather of the man who runs the funeral home where my husband was buried. The room made a sound, a small collective sound, a sound like 100 people inhaling at the same time. Most of the oldest families in this town, most of the families on the brass plaques at the bank, most of the families who sit on the boards, most of the families whose children went on to college and law school and medical school, most of you sitting in this room tonight are sitting in this room because in 1851, a woman lit a single lamp. Margaret's voice was thin, but it did not shake. And that woman, Elizabeth Holloway, was my great-great-grandmother. The mayor was crying openly. He did not bother to hide it. The building she built is the building I bought for $3. 3 weeks ago, the building all of you laughed at. The building you said was a matchbox, a pile of sticks, a waste of money. Margaret paused. That building is the oldest building in this town. It is older than your churches. It is older than your bank. It is older than the road you drove in on tonight. It is the first building, and it was built by a woman this town has forgotten. She stopped. She let the silence sit. Then she said, I am not telling you this to shame you. I am telling you this because something happened in this country a long time ago that we are still not very good at fixing. We forget the women who built everything. We forget the teachers. We forget the people who showed up in the dark with a lamp and made the world possible for the rest of us. There is a trust, Margaret said. The room went still in a different way. A trust established in 1875 by a Boston abolitionist named Cornelius Whitfield. He learned about my great-great-grandmother's work before he died. He left a sum of money in her name. The trust has been sitting unclaimed for 150 years. I am her only known living direct descendant. The trust is mine. Un murmure, a long murmur. Today the trust is worth approximately $1.8 million. The murmur became a sound. Margaret raised her hand. The sound stopped. I am not keeping it. The gymnasium went silent again. Margaret looked at the bleachers. She looked at Ruth Callahan. She looked at Brennan Ashcroft. She looked at the girl with the braids. She said, I am establishing the Elizabeth Holloway Foundation. It will be funded with $1.5 million from the trust. It will provide scholarships to children in Cedar Falls and the surrounding 3 counties whose families cannot afford the things education requires. It will pay for books, for tutors, for musical instruments, for after-school programs, for the things that level a playing field that has never been level. She breathed. It will also provide, and I want to say this clearly, adult literacy programs for grandmothers, for grandfathers, for people who never finished what they started. Because it is not too late. It is never too late. She paused. The building itself will be restored. It will become a small museum. a teaching museum. Children will come there on field trips. They will sit on the floor where 240 children sat before them. They will learn the name of a woman who lit a lamp. The girl with the braids was crying. Her mother was holding her. And I will be living next door, in a small house we are going to build. I will be the caretaker. I will keep the lamp lit for as long as I am able. And when I am no longer able, the foundation will continue, because we have arranged it that way. Margaret stopped. She looked at her hands on the podium. That is what I came to say. She turned to walk back to her seat. The room did not move for a full second, 2 seconds, and then someone began to clap. Margaret did not see who started it, but it became all of them. A sound that began as one pair of hands and became hundreds. A sound that filled the gymnasium and pushed up against the rafters and would not stop. Margaret walked back to her chair. Dorothy was already standing. The mayor was on his feet. The reporters were on their feet. The girl with the braids was standing on the bleacher in front of her seat. Her mother was holding her hand. They were both clapping. Brennan Ashcroft was clapping. His face was wet. Ruth Callahan had both hands over her face. She could not clap. She just stood, shaking. Margaret sat down in her chair. She put her hands flat on the speaker's table. She closed her eyes. She thought, I did it, Walter. I did it. She opened her eyes. She looked out at the room, and, standing in the doorway, at the back of the gymnasium, a woman with travel-tired eyes, a wool coat she had been wearing for 3 days, a suitcase on the floor next to her feet. Hair Margaret had not seen in 3 years, but would have known in any crowd in any city in the world. Adelaide, her daughter, standing in the doorway. Looking at her, Margaret's hand went to her mouth. Adelaide was crying. She did not move. She just stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame, like she was not sure if she was allowed in. Margaret stood up. Her chair scraped. The applause was still going. Margaret walked down the side of the gymnasium, down the long sideline, past the bleachers, past the basketball hoop, past 40 years of homecoming dances and graduations and pep rallies, toward her daughter. The applause faded as people realized what was happening, as people turned, as people watched. By the time Margaret reached the back of the gymnasium, it was silent again. Margaret stopped 3 feet in front of Adelaide. Neither of them moved. Adelaide opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. She said, Mom, I saw the video. Margaret nodded. I saw it 3 weeks ago. I did not. I did not know it was you at first. The angle was bad. Then I saw your hand. The way you hold your purse. Margaret nodded again. I drove. I drove from Sacramento. 3 days. I did not stop. I do not even know what I was doing. I just drove. Margaret took 1 step closer. Adelaide, Mom, I am so sorry. I am so sorry. Adelaide, I left you alone. I left you alone after Dad. I was so angry about the money, about how you handled everything. I said terrible things to you at the funeral. I have replayed them for 3 years. I could not figure out how to come back. Margaret took another step. Adelaide, you were living in your car. Adelaide, you were living in your car, and I was sitting in a 4-bedroom house in Sacramento not speaking to you. Adelaide, come here. Margaret opened her arms. Adelaide did not move. She looked at her mother's open arms like a person looking at a thing she was not sure she was allowed to have. Margaret took the last step. She put her arms around her daughter. Adelaide collapsed into her, a woman in her 40s, crying like a 6-year-old, into her 72-year-old mother's shoulder, in the back of a high school gymnasium, in front of 300 people. Margaret held her. She held her the way she had held her on the first night she had brought her home from the hospital in 1981. She whispered into her daughter's hair, You came back, you came back, you came back. She said it over and over, like a prayer, like a thing she had been waiting to say for 3 years. The applause started again. Different this time. Quieter. The kind of applause people make for something that is not a performance. The kind of applause that is really just the sound of 300 people not knowing what else to do with their feelings. Margaret did not let go of her daughter for a long time. When she finally did, Adelaide stepped back. wiped her face with both hands, like a child wipes a face. With the heels of her palms, Margaret took her daughter's hand. She turned around. She walked her daughter down the long sideline of the gymnasium, past the bleachers, past Brennan Ashcroft, past Ruth Callahan, past the girl with the braids, to the front of the room, to the speaker's table. She sat her daughter in her own chair. She stood next to her. She put her hand on Adelaide's shoulder. She looked out at the gymnasium. She did not say anything. She did not need to. 1 year later, it was October. The leaves in Cedar Falls were the color they only get for 2 weeks in October, yellow and red and copper. The light came through them, and the whole town looked like it had been dipped in honey. The restored shack stood on its original foundation. The vines were gone. The wood had been carefully treated. The roof was the original style. The windows were period-accurate glass. Inside, there were 10 small chairs around a long table, just like there had been in 1851. A small lamp on the table, a lamp that Margaret kept oiled and trimmed. Next to the shack, a small house, 1 bedroom, a kitchen, a real bathroom, a small porch with 2 rocking chairs and a wind chime hanging from the corner of the roof. The wind chime had brass pipes. It had been Walter's. Adelaide had found it in a storage unit Margaret had been paying for and forgotten about. She had brought it back from California in the back of her car. She had hung it on the porch herself. Adelaide had moved to Cedar Falls in March. She had opened a small art therapy practice in town. She worked with children, mostly children who had been through the kind of things you should not have to go through. She was good at it. She had her mother's hands. Dorothy Pemberton was the executive director of the Elizabeth Holloway Foundation. Hannah Whitfield ran the educational programming. She still worked part-time at the library. She refused to leave it. Patricia Halloran was on the board. Pro bono. Forever. Ruth Callahan ran a program called Sunday Morning at Margaret's. Free breakfasts at her bakery every Sunday morning for any senior citizen in Cedar Falls who wanted to come. The line went out the door now. Ruth was hiring more staff. Brennan Ashcroft taught a free workshop at the high school every Wednesday afternoon on digital literacy and ethics in media. He had paid for the new equipment himself. He had not made another TikTok video in 11 months. He had asked Margaret if he could give a talk to incoming freshmen every year, about what he had done, about what he had learned. Margaret had said yes. The girl with the braids was named Eloise Williams. She was the first scholarship recipient of the Elizabeth Holloway Foundation. She had wanted to play the cello, but her mother could not afford lessons. She had a cello now. She practiced on Margaret's porch sometimes, on Saturday afternoons. She was getting good. Margaret sat in one of the rocking chairs on the porch. She had a quilt over her knees. Dorothy had made it. The quilt was made of squares from 12 old shirts of Walter's. Adelaide had brought the shirts from the storage unit. Dorothy had cut them and sewn them. Margaret rocked slow. She watched the leaves move on the maple at the edge of the yard. The wind chime made its small, clean sound. She thought about the journal. She thought about the lamp. She thought about a woman in 1851, sitting at a table teaching 12 children to read. She thought about Walter at the kitchen table on Maple Street, holding her hand. She thought about the 3 $1 bills. She thought about the 17 cents. She thought about how she had not known. How she had not known. How sometimes the worst day of your life is the door you cannot see, is the door you are walking through. A car pulled into the gravel driveway. Adelaide got out. She had a paper bag from the grocery store in one arm and Eloise Williams's hand in the other. Mom, we are making chili. Are we? Eloise picked the recipe. Hi, Mrs. Holloway. Hi, sweetheart. Eloise ran up the porch steps and gave Margaret a careful hug around the quilt. Then she went inside to wash her hands. The screen door slammed behind her. Adelaide came up the porch slowly. She set the grocery bag down. She sat in the other rocking chair. She rocked. For a long minute, neither of them spoke. The wind chime made its sound. Adelaide said, Mom? Yes, Mom. Thank you. For what? For not giving up on me. Margaret reached across. She took her daughter's hand. She squeezed it. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, Your father told me. In a dream. The night after I bought this place. He told me I had done good. I did not understand what he meant. I thought he meant the shack. I thought he meant the work. I thought he meant Elizabeth. Adelaide waited. Margaret looked out at the yellow trees. But I think now he meant that I would be here, on this porch, with you, holding your hand. I think that was what he meant. I think he saw the whole thing. I think he was very pleased with me. Adelaide started to cry. Quiet. Just the way Dorothy had cried in the library that day. Tears falling without sound. Margaret squeezed her hand tighter. The wind chime sounded again. A small, clean sound. A sound like a lamp being lit. A sound like a door being opened. A sound that said, "The light does not go out." If this story touched something in you, if you have ever felt forgotten, if you have ever been laughed at for something you knew in your heart to be right, if you have ever lit a lamp for someone else and wondered if anyone would ever see it, Margaret Holloway is every woman who ever taught a child to read, every grandmother who showed up, every neighbor who walked across a yard with a pot of chicken and dumplings, every widow who held her head up, every mother who waited 3 years for a daughter to come home and did not give up. If you are one of those women, if you know one of those women, light a lamp tonight, even just a candle, for yourself, for her, for all of us. You are not forgotten. You are not too old. You are not too late. Hit the subscribe button so we can keep telling stories like this one. Leave a comment and tell us about a woman in your life who lit a lamp. Share the story with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Because the light does not go out. It came all the way down through 175 years and found a 72-year-old widow in a Buick. And it found you